Hi, I'm Alex. I want to tell you about my experience learning English. I wasn't always good at it. In fact, I struggled a lot at first. But over time, I found some really useful tips and methods that helped me learn, and I'm going to share them with you. I think it might help if you're trying to improve your English, no matter what level you're at. All right, so let's start from the very beginning. When I first decided to learn English, I didn't know where to begin. There's so much out there, right? So many words, rules, and things you have to remember. It was kind of overwhelming at first, but then I realized something important. You don't have to learn everything at once. I know it sounds obvious, but trust me, it really helped me to break it all down. The first tip I discovered was to focus on words and phrases I would use in my daily life. There's no point in memorizing a huge list of words you won't use, right? So I started with basic stuff. Like greetings, introductions, and simple questions. Words like hello, thank you, how are you, goodbye, and so on. I even wrote them down in a little notebook so I could review them whenever I had time. I remember how awkward I felt the first time I tried to speak English in front of someone. I was so nervous. But here's another tip I learned. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You see, mistakes are a part of learning. I made a ton of them, but instead of getting frustrated, I tried to learn from them. Every time I said something wrong, I just tried again until I got it right. One thing that really helped me was listening to English as much as I could. I used to think I had to understand every single word to learn something, but guess what? You don't. Listening to English regularly, whether it was through music, TV shows, or podcasts, improved my ability to understand the language without even realizing it. My listening skills got better, and it made speaking easier too. Here's a fun tip. Find something you enjoy in English, like a TV show, movie, or song. It doesn't feel like studying if you're having fun. I started watching this show that I really liked, and at first, I watched with subtitles in my own language. Then, after a while, I switched to English subtitles, and finally I tried watching without any subtitles at all. It was hard, but it helped me a lot. Another thing I realized is that pronunciation is super important. Sometimes I knew the words but didn't pronounce them correctly, and people couldn't understand me. That was frustrating, but I found a solution. Practicing speaking out loud, even if it was just to myself, helped me improve. I would say new words over and over until they sounded right. It was like training my mouth and tongue to get used to the new sounds. I even used online dictionaries that had audio so I could hear how the words were supposed to sound. Now, let's talk about grammar. Oh man, grammar is tough, isn't it? At first, it felt like a huge mountain to climb. I couldn't remember all the rules and I kept mixing things up. But one day, I realized something. You don't need to be perfect with grammar to communicate. I mean, yeah, grammar is important, but don't let it stop you from speaking. Focus on getting your point across. If you worry too much about being perfect, you'll never speak. So, I started practicing speaking in simple sentences. Over time, as I got more confident, I added more complicated grammar to my speech. I also discovered that reading in English helps a lot. At first, I read children's books because they were simple and had pictures to help me understand. Then, I moved on to short stories, and eventually, I started reading articles online. I didn't understand every word, but I got the general idea, and that's what mattered. Plus, reading helped me learn new vocabulary and context, which made it easier to remember. One of the most important things I learned was consistency. If you want to get better at English, you have to practice regularly. I set a goal for myself to practice at least 15 minutes every day. Some days I did more, some days I did less, but I made sure I did something. Whether it was speaking, listening, reading, or writing, I kept at it. It wasn't always easy, but it paid off in the end. Speaking of writing, that's another tip. Practice writing in English. I started by writing short messages to friends, and then I moved on to journaling. Writing helped me organize my thoughts and made me think about the language in a different way. Plus, it gave me a chance to practice grammar and vocabulary in a more relaxed way. No pressure, just writing for myself. One day, I found a language exchange partner online. This was a game changer for me. We would chat for a while in English, and then we'd switch to my native language so we could help each other. Finding someone to practice with is one of the best things you can do. It's not just about learning the language, it's about building confidence too. The more you practice with someone else, the easier it becomes to speak in real-life situations. As I was saying, learning English isn't just about the language itself, it's also about finding ways to fit it into your daily life. For example, I started labeling things around my house with sticky notes. I'd write the English word for objects like table, door, fridge, and so on, and every time I looked at them, I'd say the word in English. It seems small, but that constant reminder helped me remember the vocabulary without even realizing it. Surround yourself with the language, even if it's in little ways like this. Another thing that really helped was thinking in English. Now, this was tricky at first. When I started learning, I would always think in my own language and then translate it in my head, but that took too long. I noticed I was getting stuck trying to find the right words, and by the time I thought of them, the conversation had already moved on. So, I decided to try thinking directly in English, even if it was just simple thoughts like, I'm hungry, or I need to go to the store. The more I did it, the easier it became, and eventually, I didn't have to translate everything anymore. When I was learning, I also made a habit of asking questions whenever I didn't understand something. In the beginning, I was shy about asking questions because I didn't want to seem dumb, but I realized that's the only way to learn. If you don't know something, ask. Whether it's about a word, a phrase, or a grammar rule, there's always someone who can help. I would ask my teacher, my friends, and even people online. The more questions I asked, the more confident I became in using the language. Let me tell you about a funny moment I had early on in my learning journey. I was practicing English with a friend, and I wanted to say, I'm full, after we had eaten a lot of food. But instead, I said, I'm fool. My friend burst out laughing, and I had no idea why until she explained that fool means something very different. I felt embarrassed at first, but then I laughed too. Laughing at your mistakes is another important tip. If you take everything too seriously, it's easy to get discouraged. but if you can laugh and learn from it, you'll feel more relaxed and less stressed about speaking. Patience is key in this process. I remember feeling frustrated sometimes, especially when I wasn't improving as fast as I wanted to. There were days when I felt like giving up, but I had to remind myself that learning a language isn't a race. Everyone learns at their own pace, and it's okay if it takes time. There were times when I felt like I was stuck in the same place, not making any progress. But then I'd realize that even small improvements, like understanding a new word or having a smoother conversation, were signs of progress. So, my advice is, be patient with yourself. It's normal to have ups and downs, but the important thing is to keep going. Another thing that helped was setting specific goals. It's easy to say, I want to learn English, but that's a big, vague goal. So, I broke it down into smaller, more achievable goals. One week, I'd focus on learning 10 new words. Another week, I'd try to have a 5-minute conversation entirely in English. Setting goals like this kept me motivated because I could measure my progress. I'd celebrate every time I hit a goal, no matter how small it was, and it made me feel proud of what I had accomplished. Speaking of goals, I remember setting a really big one for myself, giving a presentation in English. It was for a school project, and I was terrified. I practiced for weeks, going over my speech again and again, making sure I knew all the vocabulary and grammar. When the day finally came, I was shaking with nerves, but I did it. I stumbled over a few words and forgot a sentence or two, but I made it through the whole thing in English. That experience taught me that pushing yourself out of your comfort zone is so important. It's scary, but it's the only way to grow. There's one last tip that I think might be the most important. Enjoy the process. Learning English doesn't have to be boring or feel like a chore. I tried to make it as fun as possible by incorporating the things I loved. For example, I'm really into video games, so I started playing games in English. At first, it was hard to understand everything, but over time, it helped me improve my reading and listening skills without even thinking about it. If you can find something you enjoy, whether it's games, books, music, or sports, and connect it to learning English, it makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable. You won't even realize you're learning because you'll be having fun. I also made friends from other countries who were learning English too, and we would help each other. It was great because we were all at different levels, so we could teach each other new things. Finding a community of learners is super helpful. You can share tips, motivate each other, and even laugh together at the funny mistakes you'll make along the way. Having people around you who understand what you're going through makes the journey feel a lot less lonely. Looking back, I'm amazed at how far I've come. There were so many moments when I thought I'd never be able to speak English fluently, but here I am, telling you my story in English. And if I can do it, so can you. Just remember the tips I've shared. Start with the basics. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Listen and read as much as you can. Practice speaking out loud. And most importantly, enjoy the process. It's not always going to be easy, but every step you take brings you closer to fluency. One day, you'll look back like I did and realize how much you've learned. You might even laugh at the mistakes you made along the way. But trust me, it'll all be worth it in the end. So, what are you waiting for? Start your English journey today, and before you know it, you'll be sharing your own story, just like I am now. So, after I started feeling a little more comfortable with English, I decided it was time to challenge myself even more. I didn't just want to know the basics, you know? I wanted to be able to have real conversations, understand jokes, and even watch movies without subtitles. The thought of it was pretty exciting, but also kind of scary. I kept reminding myself that it was all part of the journey. And with every step forward, things that used to feel impossible started to feel more within reach. One thing I noticed was that the more I practiced, the more my confidence grew. And here's a funny thing about confidence. It doesn't come all at once, but it builds slowly, like stacking one small brick at a time. For example, I used to get so nervous when ordering food in English. I'd practice what I wanted to say in my head over and over again before I spoke, and if the person behind the counter said something I didn't understand, I'd freeze. But after doing it a few times, I started to realize that most people don't care if you make mistakes. They just want to help, and they appreciate that you're trying. So, I stopped worrying so much about sounding perfect and just focused on communicating. There was this one time I went to a restaurant, and instead of asking for a spoon, I accidentally asked for a spin because I confused the words. The waiter looked confused, and I quickly corrected myself. We both laughed, and I realized it wasn't such a big deal after all. That's when I learned the value of staying relaxed when speaking English. If you're too stressed, it's hard to focus. But if you stay calm and go with the flow, you'll be able to communicate more naturally. Now, I want to talk about something that really helped me make huge progress: practicing speaking with native speakers. I was lucky enough to have a friend who was a native English speaker, and they were super patient with me. We'd hang out, and they'd gently correct me when I made mistakes, but they never made me feel embarrassed about it. It's one of the best ways to learn because you're hearing the language in its natural form, with all the slang, expressions, and idioms that you don't always find in textbooks. If you don't have a native speaker to talk to, there are apps and websites where you can find language exchange partners. I can't tell you how much that helped me. One of the coolest things about talking to native speakers is that you start to pick up on the rhythm and flow of the language. English has a certain musicality to it, like the way people stress different words in a sentence. It's something you don't always get when you're just studying grammar from a book. It took me a while to get used to, but after listening to enough conversations and practicing myself, I started to get the hang of it. I wasn't just speaking English. I was beginning to sound more natural, more like I belonged in the conversation. Speaking of sounding natural, let me tell you about the time I discovered English idioms. Oh man, at first they were so confusing. I remember the first time I heard someone say, "It's raining cats and dogs." I literally imagined cats and dogs falling from the sky. I had no idea what it meant until my friend explained that it's just a funny way of saying it's raining really hard. Idioms like that don't always make sense when you translate them word for word, but they're a huge part of the language, and people use them all the time. Once I started learning idioms and practicing them, I felt like I'd unlocked a whole new level of English. Here's a tip. Don't be afraid to dive into things that seem confusing at first, like idioms or phrasal verbs. They might not make sense right away, but the more you see them in context, the clearer they'll become. I started writing down idioms I heard and looking up their meanings. Slowly but surely, I started using them in conversations. It felt amazing to throw out a phrase like, hit the books, when talking about studying, or break the ice when talking about meeting new people. It made me feel like I was really getting the hang of English, not just the basics, but the stuff that makes it fun and interesting. Another breakthrough for me was when I started thinking about English as a tool, not just a subject to study. You see, I used to approach it like it was just another subject in school, like math or history. But English is so much more than that. It's a way to connect with people, a way to experience different cultures, and even a way to access information that I wouldn't have been able to understand before. Once I started using English as a tool, reading articles, watching tutorials on things I was interested in, and talking to people from different parts of the world, it stopped feeling like something I had to learn and started feeling like something I wanted to learn. There was one moment that really stood out to me and made me realize how far I'd come. I was watching a movie in English, one of those superhero movies with lots of action and dialogue, and for the first time, I didn't need subtitles. I understood the jokes, the conversations, the plot, everything. Sure, I didn't catch every single word, but I got the meaning, and that was such a cool feeling. It was like all the pieces had finally come together. I had worked so hard, and now I was able to enjoy something completely in English without needing help. I can't even explain how proud I felt in that moment. It's funny because when I started, I never thought I'd reach that point. It seemed so far away. But that's the thing about learning. It's all about the little steps you take every day. Consistency really is everything. There were days when I didn't feel like studying, days when I was tired or frustrated, but I always made sure to do a little bit, even if it was just listening to a podcast while walking or reviewing a few vocabulary words before bed. And over time, all those little efforts added up. And here's something else I realized along the way. Celebrate your victories, no matter how small. Learning a language is a huge achievement, and you should be proud of every step you take. Whether it's understanding a sentence, using a new word in a conversation, or even making someone laugh with a joke in English, those are all wins. Don't wait until you're fluent to celebrate. Celebrate the process because that's where the real growth happens. So, where am I now in my English learning journey? Well, I can confidently say that I'm fluent now. But that doesn't mean I've stopped learning. English, like any language, is always evolving, and there's always more to learn. I still come across new words and expressions, and I still make mistakes sometimes. But that's okay because I've learned to embrace the process. I've come to love learning, not just English, but everything that comes with it. The people, the culture, the experiences. I guess what I'm trying to say is, learning English isn't just about the destination, it's about the journey. It's about the ups and downs, the challenges and the victories, and everything in between. And if you stick with it, you'll not only learn a new language, you'll discover so much more about yourself along the way. So, to anyone out there trying to learn English, I say this: don't give up, keep going, and most importantly, enjoy the ride. One day, you'll look back and be amazed at how far you've come. After I started feeling pretty confident in everyday conversations, something new popped up that I wasn't expecting: formal English. You know, the kind you use in professional settings, like when you write an email for work or speak in a more serious tone. It's one thing to chat with friends or order food at a restaurant, but it's a whole different challenge when you need to sound professional. I realized that while I was doing well with casual English, I still had a lot to learn when it came to using the language in more formal situations. So here's what I did next. I started focusing on learning formal phrases and polite expressions. I wasn't sure where to begin, so I started by looking at sample emails and formal conversations online. I noticed that in English, politeness plays a huge role in formal communication. Instead of saying, "give me," you say, "could you please send me?" Or instead of saying, "I don't agree," you might say, "I'm afraid I have to disagree." It's all about softening your tone to sound more respectful. One of the best resources I found for this was TED Talks. They're these great speeches that cover all sorts of topics, and the speakers often use more formal language. I'd watch them with subtitles, pausing whenever I heard an interesting phrase or sentence structure. Then, I'd try to use those same phrases when writing or speaking in a more formal setting. If you're trying to improve your formal English, I definitely recommend watching TED Talks or any kind of public speaking. It's a great way to learn how to present ideas clearly and professionally. Speaking of presenting, I had to give another presentation in English, but this time it wasn't just for school, it was for a job interview. That was a whole new level of nerve-wracking. I had applied for a part-time job at a company where English was the main language, and part of the interview process was giving a short presentation on a project I had worked on. I spent hours practicing. I made sure to prepare for the typical interview questions too, like, "Why do you want this job?" and "What are your strengths and weaknesses?" Here's a tip if you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Practice out loud in front of a mirror. It sounds a little weird, but it really helps. I would look at myself in the mirror, pretend I was talking to the interviewer, and go over my answers again and again. It helped me feel more confident when the actual interview day came. And guess what? I got the job. That was a big milestone for me, using English not just in casual conversations, but in a professional setting, and it felt amazing. Now that I was working in an English-speaking environment, I learned even more about how language changes depending on the situation. For example, in the office, people often used what I like to call business English. It's a bit more formal than everyday conversation, but not as stiff as super formal writing. There are all these phrases that people use all the time in meetings or emails, like circle back, touch base, or moving forward. At first, these expressions sounded strange to me, but after hearing them again and again, I started using them too. One thing I noticed is that workplace English involves a lot of collaboration. It's not just about knowing the language, it's about knowing how to communicate ideas clearly, respond to feedback, and work with others. I had to learn how to contribute in meetings, express my ideas, and even disagree politely when necessary. That's when I realized something important. Communication isn't just about words, it's also about how you use them to build relationships. Whether it's with coworkers, clients, or even friends, The way you communicate shapes how people see you. At work, I also learned a lot about writing in English. I had to write emails, reports, and sometimes even longer documents. Writing in English is different from speaking because you have more time to think about what you're going to say, but that also means you have to be more careful about grammar and word choice. I made a lot of mistakes at first. My sentences were too long, or I used the wrong tone, but over time, I improved. I started paying more attention to the structure of my writing, making sure my points were clear, and using polite language to come across professionally. One trick that helped me was to read a lot of well-written materials. I'd read emails from my manager or reports from other departments, paying close attention to how they structured their sentences and which words they used. It's funny because when I started out, I didn't think reading emails would be part of my English learning journey, but it really helped. I'd try to imitate their style in my own writing, and little by little, I got better at it. As I got deeper into my job, something else became really important: listening and understanding English in fast-paced environments. You know how in normal conversations, people might slow down or repeat things if you don't understand. Well, that doesn't always happen at work. In meetings, everyone's talking quickly, throwing around technical terms or industry jargon, and it's easy to get lost if you're not prepared. Here's what I did to keep up. I started taking notes during meetings. At first, I'd just write down key words or phrases that I didn't understand, and later I'd look them up. Over time, I built up a list of terms that were commonly used in my field. This helped me keep up with conversations and made me feel more confident during meetings. Plus, I wasn't afraid to ask for clarification if I didn't understand something. There's no shame in asking questions. It shows that you're paying attention and that you care about getting things right. Around this time, I also started listening to podcasts about business and work-related topics in English. It was a great way to get used to the speed and vocabulary people used in professional settings. At first, I had to pause and rewind a lot, but after a few weeks, I noticed I was understanding more and more without having to stop. It's amazing how your brain adapts when you immerse yourself in the language like that. And speaking of immersion, there's one last tip I want to share that really helped me: traveling and experiencing English in a new environment. After a few years of studying and working, I had the opportunity to travel to an English-speaking country for a business trip. It was my first time being completely surrounded by English, and it was a game changer. Everything, from ordering food to navigating the city to attending meetings, was in English. It forced me to think in English all the time, and it was one of the best learning experiences I've ever had. There's something about being fully immersed in the language that pushes you to improve faster. It's like your brain switches to English mode because it has no other choice. I highly recommend traveling or finding a way to immerse yourself in the language, even if it's just for a short time. If you can't travel, try to create an immersive environment at home by surrounding yourself with English media, conversations, and experiences. The more you expose yourself to the language, the faster you'll improve. Looking back on my journey, I've come a long way from the nervous beginner who could barely say hello without stumbling. I've learned so much, not just about English, but about myself. I've grown more confident, more patient, and more open to making mistakes. And most importantly, I've learned that language isn't just about words. It's about connection, culture, and communication. So, if you're still on your English learning journey, remember this. Keep pushing yourself, stay curious, and never stop learning. There's always something new to discover, and every step you take brings you closer to fluency. Whether you're just starting out or you're already speaking confidently, there's always room to grow. And no matter how hard it feels sometimes, trust me, it's worth it.